Studio. For the Scholar's Chair, here is your host. Welcome to the Scholar's Chair. I am Khalil. It is the 17th century English philosopher John Locke who said, "Nothing being so beautiful to the eye as truth is to the mind, nothing so deformed or irreconcilable to understanding as a lie." Tonight, an essay concerning human understanding, the writings of philosopher John Locke. Our guest tonight to explore this topic is Mr. Don Evans from the Secular Humanist Organization, the Washington Area Secular Humanist Organization. Welcome, Don, back to the Scholar's Chair. And a newcomer to the Scholar's Chair, Dr. Deen Ahmed from the Minaret of Freedom Institute. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you.
Welcome. Good that you could join us, and I'm excited about knowing more about the Minaret Freedom Foundation and Institute. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Well, yes, the Minaret of Freedom Institute was formed in 1993 and has a fourfold mission: to counter distortions about Islam, to show the origin of certain modern values that came out of the Islamic civilization, to educate both Muslims and non-Muslims on the importance of liberty and free markets, and to advance the status of Muslims, whether they live in the oppressive East or the hostile West.
Oh, we need it. We need it. Don, tell us about the Washington Area Secular Humanist Organization.
Washington Area Secular Humanists was founded about 15 years ago, just in the Washington, D.C. area. It's since expanded to 7 chapters covering most of Virginia, from Charlottesville up through Northern Virginia and into Maryland. We have 7 chapters, and basically what we do, we're seek to be a community of people that are interested in a critical approach to human history, to questions of human values, to politics, from a non-theistic, or you might call atheistic, although we usually avoid that word, but from a secular point of view. We're strong advocates of the separation of church and state, although we're also equally strong advocates for civil liberties and the rights of every person to their own opinion, even if it's different from ours. We feel that the best society is one which enables different opinions and ideas to flourish, to enter into dialogue with each other in a nonviolent way.
That's good. I like first the last part, the nonviolent part of it. Tell us, what is your view of John Locke historically? Who was this guy?
Well, I think John Locke was, of course, was a 17th century philosopher born in 1632, died in 1704. His father was a lawyer, and who died when he was a fairly young man, but left him a bit of an inheritance. He wound up gravitating to the university at Oxford, where he taught for a while in the area of moral philosophy. And then, of course, the 17th century was a time of great political upheaval. His father was one of the Puritans, and John Locke was raised in the atmosphere of the Puritans. However, they were liberal Puritans. They weren't extreme. And I think what John Locke took from that background was a critical approach to questions of value, particularly questions of politics. Later in his life, he actually didn't really publish anything until he was in his 50s. He wrote important works, including the essay concerning human understanding, 2 treatises on government, works on education, and several very important and progressive letters and pamphlets on tolerance, of which he was a big advocate. He was forced to leave England and lived in Holland for a few years during the reign of James II. And after James II was pretty much deposed and William of Orange was asked to come over to England to be king, John Locke actually accompanied William's wife, who then became Queen Mary II of England.
That's a historic. He fits in very nicely. Ahmed, Dr. Ahmed, tell us your take on John Locke. What are your feelings about this man?
Well, I think there's no question John Locke was one of the most influential people in bringing the Western world into the modern era, along with second maybe to Isaac Newton. Locke took some of those new ideas about critical thinking, and he explained them in a way that influenced not only philosophers but political activist as well, and therefore had an impact beyond academia and on a lot of movements, including the nascent, American experiment. Of particular interest to me is the way that Locke introduced some ideas that had developed in the Muslim world into Western society. Of course, we'll be talking about his concept of epistemology tonight, but another area that is of interest, well, maybe related to it, was that apparently Locke was influenced by Ibn Tufayl. Locke had said that he was a pragmatist. In his diary, he said he was a pragmatist until 1671, when he changed his mind after attending a party given by a university professor in London. And historians have identified that this probably was Edwin Pocock, who in that year had translated the book Awake, the Son of Alive, the Son of Awake by Ibn Tufayl into Latin as the self-taught philosopher, in which ideas about man being born tabula rasa without innate ideas, and how human beings acquired knowledge, and what the role of law is in the development of human civilization were all explored in that book. And then subsequently, after that, we begin to see these ideas in the writings of John Locke.
That's fascinating. You bring a nice angle to this. Tell me, this book is huge. I mean, this is a huge work. Why is it so relevant to the world of philosophy? Maybe we can start with Don here.
I think there are two answers to that. First is simply historically, the book made a tremendous impression on contemporaries, even though it was published late in Locke's life, and he only lived, I think, about 10 or so years after it was published, but also his other writings, the Treatise on Government. And it turned out that he was considered so important that virtually everyone in the English school system, the university system, was required to read Locke. And that in itself created, students having to write papers and discuss things with their professors and so forth, creates it. But outside of the fact that there's other instances of books like that, like Bishop Butler, who lived in the 18th century, also was required reading for over 100 years, but is probably very little known today. Somewhat of a shame, but from my point of view. But the other thing about Locke is, and unlike Butler perhaps, is that Locke had a very accessible style. I was interested to find, reading him after some years, that his English, although late 17th century, is actually
pretty good, yeah.
Pretty accessible to a modern English reader, much more so than some of his contemporaries or near contemporaries, like Thomas Hobbes, who is much more difficult. That's not to say he's easy to read, but there's a certain clarity, and Locke prided himself on trying to attain clarity, and I think above all by trying to appeal to what commentators have called just simply common sense. He asks you, well, think about this. Look at it this way. Here's what I think. What do you think? Here's why I think this is a helpful idea. I may be wrong. He also was not dogmatic. He always felt that you had to argue for ideas, you had to consider other opinions. He was very broad in considering objections to his views and trying to deal with them as best he could. I think one of the other things is he never really sewed everything up into a very neat package. There are areas in his writings which seem, if not to contradict other areas on the same, there are in tension with them, and commentators continue to look at them. But Locke is never, if he is wrong or inconsistent, it's a reflection of the difficulty of the subject matter and not an arbitrariness or a lack of deep thought on his part.
I like to think so. You're very helpful. My good friend, Brother Ahmed, I want to ask you the same question. Why is this text so relevant from your perspective?
Well, first, let me begin by saying that, I think that this humility of Locke that has been commented upon is intrinsic to the notions of the theory of knowledge that he's putting forward. In other words, it would be very self-contradictory to be dogmatic about one's theory of knowledge when one's theory of knowledge is that there are only a limited number of things we can be certain about, and that the things that we don't know vastly exceed the things that we do know. Now, as for your immediate question as to why he's so influential, well, I mean, look at his influence on the United States. When we study Thomas Jefferson's work, say the Declaration of Independence, people comment not on Locke's influence, but on the differences, because the influence is so overwhelming that there's no point in discussing it. So when Jefferson says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, people ask, why did he say pursuit of happiness and not property, as Locke had said?
Interesting ideas about property, isn't it? What Locke says. He actually says that without property, what's the exact quote? I'm trying to remember it. I have it right here in front of me.
Yes,
he said, where there is no property, there is no injustice. Where no property, there is no injustice.
Yeah, and this is where he's exploring one of the aspects of knowledge, where he talks about there are certain things that are inherent in an idea that makes us know that it is true. And he gives this as the example. If there's no property, there's no injustice. The idea of property is that we believe that it is just for some things to belong to some person for some reason. Without going into the details of what this is and who it is and why it's just the abstract notion that unless you do believe that, then how can you even talk about injustice? Now, of course, there are questions about how far you can take this. For example, is murder an act of injustice? If so, and I think most people would say it is, well, where is the property involved? Now, see, some philosophers would say, well, that is because one has a property in one's own life. But then that in itself raises more questions about, is it really property? Is it alienable? The way other property is, which brings us back to Jefferson. Jefferson was listing the inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, whereas property is alienable. Something might belong to me at one point in time, but I can give it away, I can lose my right to it, I can sell it, I can, and so on and so forth.
What is the idea of property ownership in the Islamic tradition?
Well, it's very interesting that definitely in Islam, the notion of property has a very, very high status. One can look, for example, at the farewell pilgrimage of the Prophet, peace be upon him, in which he said, your lives and your property are sacred to you, as sacred as this day is sacred. And he's speaking on the high holy day of Islam. He's putting the right to property up with the right to life and with the high holy day of the religion. These things are sacred. Then also, of course, we find in the Quran the protection of property is a very, very major issue, talking about in various places, not only one's own property, the right to defend one's own property, but also to discuss about how you deal with property held in trust, what a gross violation it is if you treat the property you're holding in trust as if it is your own property and use it to your own benefit instead of that for whom it is held in trust.
Interesting. I've always loved the correlation between the Enlightenment folk of the West and the tradition of Islam. That's always been a very fascinating thing for me. Locke says that we have knowledge no further than we have ideas. Is this an idea that you can expand on, Don? And do you agree with it?
Well, I think once again, this may appear to be a very simple statement, but a lot lurks behind it. I guess reading this, not knowing where it comes from or the context, I would have to say that it seems to be saying that all knowledge is in the form of something called ideas. I think of ideas in terms of intellectual things which can be put into words. Philosophers put them into things called propositions and debate them. In other words, it's very intimately related to language. But I think there's another sense of knowledge, and it certainly existed in Locke's time, and he does not really, as far as I know, deal with this specifically, and that's the sense of knowledge and sense of knowing how to do something. knowing how to fish, knowing how to find your way to work in the morning, knowing a language.